We cannot let the military services call all the shots, and we can't let the Congress call all the shots, or we're going to have chaos in our national security program of the future.
And if Gorbachev can be clever enough to trade an already declining Warsaw Pact for the U.S. presence in Europe, he'll have made a hell of a good deal.
Now they're trying to show there's no threat to NATO because they present this smiling face, this kinder, gentler Soviet Union that's letting all of its satellites go their own way, and that does not remove the threat.
We are not going to stand by while our European allies cut their forces and we pay more to defend them. That is not politically salable to the American people.
The Warsaw Pact is dead, but we can't look for anything more than the words were small reductions in the defense budget. It doesn't add up.
Going forward, we're going to have to make a judgment as to what role our country ought to play, and a passive role would be terribly dangerous. But who do we want to provide leadership in the world? Somebody else?
The third annual report of the Secretaries of Defense was recorded on December 1st, 1989 at the Tennessee Performing Arts Center in Nashville. This program was produced by the Southern Center for International Studies and was held in cooperation with Vanderbilt University. The theme of this conference is U.S. Defense Beyond the Cold War. The moderator of this program is Hedrick Smith, journalist, commentator, and award-winning author.
We're meeting at one of the most extraordinary moments of history since World War II. The Soviet Empire seems to be crumbling, the Cold War ending. What are the challenges, the opportunities, the dangers in all of this? I will be joined today in the questioning by Henry Truitt, former Deputy Managing Editor for International Affairs at U.S. News and World Report, and presently Professor at the University of New Mexico. Gentlemen, this world of ours is changing shape. We're now in a much freer situation. We don't know where it's going. What are the 1, 2, 3 most fundamental interests and goals that we should have in mind? Mr. McNamara.
It's going to be a world of conflict. In that world of conflict, how do we deal with it in ways that do not involve East and West in conflict one with another? That's important in relation to Eastern Europe. The last two great leaders of the Western world who had a vision of a world of that kind were Roosevelt and Churchill. They put it forward in 1941, long before they were winning the war in Europe. They looked ahead to the post-World War II world. They put it forward in the Atlantic Charter. It's a dramatic document. They added to it later with the proposal for the UN. It was to be a world of relations among states based on the rule of law, a system of collective security enforced by conflict resolution activities and peacekeeping forces of the international organizations. Is that our vision? Let's talk about the world of the future.
Let's talk about that. Secretary Schlesinger, tell us what, and I want to go around and hear you other gentlemen talk about this very important point. What are our goals in a new era?
Well, it is axiomatic that we cannot afford to disarm against the Soviet threat until that threat begins to decline. It has started to decline, but we should not anticipate further declines. That is axiomatic. Beyond that, the nature of Western Europe is changing. And there is a deep desire, particularly amongst Germany's neighbors, to keep American forces in Europe as an element of what is politely referred to as stabilization, which means they're concerned about the recrudescence of a powerful Germany. And we ought to be part of that. We have gone to Europe twice in this century to deal with disruptions, a European civil war. American forces help to stabilize it. Secondly, we want to see the emergence, the gradual emergence of Eastern Europe and its reunification in an economic sense with the Western economies and the Western culture. That is what we have been fighting for, in a sense, striving for the last 40 years. And in that respect, we have been phenomenally successful. But the Khomeinis of this world, the Gaddafis of this world are going to be with us for a long time. Those in the Department of State who have proclaimed the end of history with the end of the Cold War are in error. We will need to have a continuing worldwide capability, and it may be reduced from its present size, but the United States will be the chief guarantor of international stability. I hope we continue to fulfill that role.
Mr. Carlucci, let me throw it to you. What are our goals in the new era, and particularly focusing on Europe, but not exclusively Europe?
Well, there's no question, Hedrick, but what the nature of the threat in Central Europe has changed. The possibility of a lightning strike through the Fulda Gap no longer exists, and we're going to have to look at a new force structure. And here you get into the question of doctrine. The conventional forces, the CFE talks, have pointed at exactly that area where we've reached a tentative agreement, at least, to come down to common ceilings on such destabilizing weaponry as tanks and self-propelled artillery. So if we move to a defensive doctrine in Europe, it is clear that through the process of negotiation, and I emphasize that point, we can reduce our forces. Jim Schlesinger has described the problems in the rest of the world, which probably means we have to have a flexible force, the ability to project our power, as we did in areas of the Persian Gulf. So the military part of the equation, it seems to me, is relatively clear. What is far more complex is the political part of the equation, the reunification of Germany, how impact this will have on Europe 92, how the Eastern Europe is absorbed, if at all, into the Western economic structure. So a lot more attention is going to have to be paid to the political than to the pure military side of the equation.
Let's talk to an experienced politician, and not only a former Secretary of Defense, but a former Congressman, Secretary Laird. What's your vision of our goals? What are our political urgings and needs now?
Well, my concern is that we haven't enunciated them very clearly, and we're going forward with a piecemeal approach to the whole military national security posture of this country. We've got to take the leadership in the Department of Defense. We cannot let the military services call all the shots, and we can't let the Congress call all the shots, or we're going to have chaos in our national security program of the future. And I think that's, when I read these stories coming out day after day, about $150 billion cut from the Department of Defense without any realism of what it means to the national security program. When I look at all these quick fixes that are going on in the defense business today and are proposed in the Congress, are proposed by some of the services, we've got to reestablish a tight leadership in the Department of Defense. We have to take the initiative. We can't let Congress and the individual military services dictate what's going to happen in the next few years. So those goals and objectives, the strategy, has to be worked out, and it has not been worked out in this year.
Mr. Weinberger, your goals and strategies.
Well, I think we have a very simple strategy and a very simple set of goals, and they're hard to realize. And the strategy and the goals both are that we want to live in peace with our neighbors and live our lives as we wish to do without interference by war or by a threat of war or by attack. And that's what we want to preserve. And the question of how you preserve that requires far more defense than we as a people have been willing to spend for the most part. We talk about why the Soviet threat has declined. It's declined because we regained great strength and because NATO stood firm and deployed the counters to the SS-20s when the Soviets felt it was absolutely impossible that they would do that they were sure they could talk us out of it. We're in Europe.
That's part of it.
We're in Europe not for altruistic purposes only, although there's a lot of altruism in what we've done with the Marshall Plan and with NATO. But we're in Europe because it's the very best place to defend the United States.
What's going to be the role of NATO 5 years from now?
Well, I hope it's the same role that it's been now, that it will keep Europe at peace because it's strong and united. The Soviets are now using a different tactic. They haven't changed the strategy. The strategy has been to end NATO. Previously, they tried to do it by threat and intimidation and moving their submarines closer to the United States if we didn't do what they liked or if we deployed and so on. Now they're trying to show there's no threat to NATO because they present this smiling face, this kinder, gentler Soviet Union that's letting all of its satellites go their own way, and that does not remove the threat.
Mr. Rumsfeld, your vision and what's the concept of where we're going?
Let me see if I can answer it this way. Cap's correct. Our first goal is to have a peaceful world, a stable world. Our second goal, I would add, however, is that people live in freedom. That's our preference, certainly requirement for ourselves and our preference for others. Our third is that they have economies with sufficient vitality, that there's not enormous hunger and dislocation in the world. So those are our goals. And then the question comes, well, what's our role? And we've got to decide that role going forward. We decided it early on after World War II. We made a conscious decision that we were going to play a leading role in the world. There are those who suggest today that the United States is in decline, that in fact we should sit back and allow someone else to contribute to the stability in the world. I happen to disagree with that, and I think that we need to provide leadership, and I think that leadership can make an enormous difference in what the world's going to look like in the 1990s and the year 2000. But the big misunderstanding, it seems to me, is illustrated by this fact. If you read the newspapers or watch television today and you look at the polls, first, they rank Gorbachev as the reason that these changes are occurring. And second, they gave Reagan some credit. Then they give a very small amount of credit to Kohl, a little bit of credit to Krantz, and a little bit of credit to somebody else, which is ridiculous. The credit belongs to Truman and Adenauer and to steadfastness over a period of 40 years. The credit goes to the investments of billions of dollars over a long, sustained period of time by people who were carped at and criticized and said, oh my goodness, you're warmongers. It went to the concept of peace through strength. And we need to understand how we got to where we are, because going forward, we're going to have to make a judgment as to what role our country ought to play. And a passive role would be terribly dangerous. I mean, who do we want to provide leadership in the world? Somebody else? Who? Name him.
Let's pick up right there and continue this theme of NATO and of a leading United States role in it. Let me just cite some of the factors that are going to be working to diminish that role. One, there's going to be pressure to bring Americans home. A second factor that is going to be working against a continuing leading United States role in Europe is going to be the reunification question we've dealt with in several contexts, and the other is 1992 and the economic unification of Europe. Pick up on that, if you would, Secretary Schlesinger.
Well, I think it is plain that the American role in Europe is diminishing. The United States, as it draws down its forces and as Europe unifies, indeed will play a smaller role. Even today, only 30% of the German people, according to polls, want to have foreign forces on German soil. And as we move further and the threat seems to recede, assuming there's not an immediate backlash in the Soviet Union, our role must diminish. But that's what we strove for, a revived Western Europe after World War II. That's what the Marshall Plan was all about.
Secretary McNamara, on that question, then, is the United States role, can it be securely and safely diminished?
I think we can move down the path that Gorbachev has pointed to, toward ending the Cold War, toward very substantial reductions in defense, and I hope we'll get to that in a moment. And I think we can do it safely, because at every step of the way, I'm not proposing unilateral arms reduction. Even Gorbachev hasn't suggested that the West disarm unilaterally. He's proposed, and we have proposed, a START treaty that will cut nominal 50% of strategic nuclear weapons. How are we going to be worse off as a result of that? If we negotiate that properly, we'll be stronger. The Conventional Force Treaty proposes asymmetrical reductions to eliminate the Soviet or the Warsaw Pact 2 to 3 times numerical advantage in tanks, artillery tubes, helicopter, and so on, down to a level of equality with NATO. How will that make us worse off? We're bound to be better off. I don't want to go much further except to say, I believe that we can go down this path, we can run the risk that Gorbachev fails and succeeded by Stalin, and not endanger ourselves in the process. If I may take just 30 seconds more, I think this question of leadership is extremely important, and I hope we'll talk more about that. We're going to a world of conflict of the kind that Jim pointed to and I pointed to. The world of the 21st century is going to be conflict within nations and between nations, no question about that. The problem is to keep from engaging the superpowers and their allies in that conflict in ways that bring us into conflict. I think we can avoid that. But leadership is not based on military power alone. Leadership is based on economic strength and social cohesion. And we have very, very serious weaknesses in those areas in our society today. It's based on moral leadership. We got a few problems there. A year ago, today almost, Sakharov stepped across the Soviet border for the first time. he and Velikov, the vice chairman of the Academy, came to this country to meet with some of us in the National Academy of Sciences building, directly across from the Secretary of State's office, snow on the ground. For 3 days in a row, Sakharov and Velikov stepped across the bodies of 2 men sleeping on a grate trying to keep warm. I don't think we're ready to lead if we continue that kind of thing.
Let me add a footnote to what Don Rumsfeld said. Yesterday, I was talking to a U.S. general officer, and he said that when the East Germans came through the newly formed holes in the wall, the East German military, they turned to the American military and said, "You made this possible because you stayed in Europe." And I think it is vitally important for the security of Europe and to reassure those who may be living in what at best will be unstable circumstances that the United States presence in one way or another will remain. There's no question that a number of Gorbachev's arms reduction proposals are sincere, but there's equally no question that a number of them are just pure propaganda. Nuclear-free zones, Mediterranean free of nuclear ships, will swap Philippine bases for Cam Bay. Those kinds of things are sheer nonsense, and they are clearly designed to divide the United States from our allies. The Warsaw Pact, as a military entity, has never been all that much. And if Gorbachev can be clever enough to trade an already declining Warsaw Pact, which has been basically a problem for him, for the U.S. presence in Europe, he'll have made a hell of a good deal.
The rest of you on Eastern Europe.
I'd like to say a little bit about this idea of that we aren't really taking any risk. The Soviet Union is a country in which you can take 500,000 people out of the Central Front and turn them into farmers overnight, and you can turn them back into soldiers also overnight. And we can't do that. And we cannot make this quick recovery from deep, deep cuts that may or may not be being made in the Soviet Union overnight. It takes us about 7, 8, 9 years to do it. And sadly, I happen to know how long it takes and how hard it is to sustain the public opinion necessary in this country, which is what we want to do that. We've had a lot of talk about how the Defense Department has to take the initiative, I think Mel put it, and all of that. The problem is that we can take the initiative in the department all we want, but we can't spend a nickel if Congress doesn't approve. And Congress has approved grudgingly some of the higher budgets, and now is leaping on the whole budget picture with the greatest of joy, because it's not going to reduce the deficit, but it's going to add to the domestic spending, which is politically more popular. So we have a lot to worry about if we rush into any idea that the threat is down and that it is perfectly all right to make these deep, deep reductions, which are so hard to recover from for us and so easy for the Soviets.
Cap, Congress really reflects the view of the American people in this area. And I think that if you have the kind of leadership that's needed and necessary to direct the proper use of the defense dollars, and you get the public to understand that, Congress will respond. That's right. Congress really reflects the American public, and this Congress bashing I don't think does any good as far as national security or defense policy.
I think Congress reflects to a very considerable and unfortunate extent the interests that help get them elected. And the strongest lobbies are not defense lobbies. The strongest lobbies are the
lobby is the people.
Let me say a word about
politics is simple mathematics. You just add up the votes.
Yeah, that's right. And the votes are generated by special interests that contribute to campaigns, and the contributions, as we've seen in the S&L problems and all the rest, are derived from people who want those contributions.
No, I don't think the American
politics is
people
addition,
can
not
be
subtraction.
Bought. The American people cannot be bought, Cap.
Ultimately, that's right, but there are a lot of perils in between.
Let me say a word about reductions. It seems to me that the changes that we've been discussing obviously have been thrilling, spectacular, incredible, historically unique. Given that fact, and we all understand that, how can we as a country be talking about arms reductions and arms control negotiations and conventional force reductions and strategic reductions, and now he's proposing naval reductions? How can we be talking about that the way we were 6 months ago? Those old discussions were based on a different world. They were based on a different set of facts in Europe.
And I am worried that the momentum of all these bureaucrats and negotiators and lawyers and people engaged in this arms control process are going to just be like busy little bees charging right along the track they were on. If we behave off what the threat is, and as the threat is reduced, take steps that reflect our understanding of a reduced threat, we might be better off than all of the lawyers and negotiators and crossed I's and dotted I's, frankly, much of which doesn't work anyway.
I want to ask Jim Schlesinger.
Arms negotiations do not create changes in the world, in my view. They reflect changes in the world.
Let me strongly endorse what Don Rumsfeld has said. The problem we have at the moment is that the process of change in Eastern Europe, which is simply staggering and no one anticipated, is getting ahead of the whole arms control process. And the worst thing for national security, the national security establishment, is to begin to bleat the old refrains, which will make the national security establishment seem to be irrelevant to the publics that it serves.
Oh, I think the Warsaw Pact as an alliance is all but dead. But I'm not sure there isn't a least. For example, Gorbachev has made it very clear that the reunification of Germany under existing political circumstances is a no-no. And I don't know what reaction they would take, but they still have a substantial number of troops, over 300,000 in East Germany, and they could move those troops. So I don't think we need to dismiss totally the Tiananmen Square or the short leash kind of reaction as improbable as it seems at this point.
You've raised Germany again. We really haven't dealt with that question. There's tremendous momentum towards it. People like Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski are both saying that the reunification of Germany is inevitable, regardless of what Gorbachev has to say. Where do we stand, Secretary Laird? Where do we stand? How do we play that? What do we do? And do we need to fear a reunited Germany as we look at Europe uniting?
A confederation between East and West Germany with Soviet forces still in East Germany is not that much of a threat to anybody.
Okay, but let's take 80 million strong, united in a confederation under a single leader. Let me try Mr. Laird again.
Conversation I've had recently with former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, I thought his advice to the United States was very good. He feels that a unification of Germany will come about, but the best thing that we should do in the United States is to stay out of it.
Well, Helmut Schmidt has always passed out a very large amount of free advice, and an astonishing amount of it has been wrong in the past. And so I would not want to guide on that. I do think that we have to stay in Europe. I think it is all
Germany,
very...
the issue of Germany, do we want to see reunited?
The issue of Germany, I think we're talking about, though, Cap.
That's true, but the issue of Germany led us into a discussion of how much we need to let it happen entirely by German wishes alone, and that we no longer have any basic responsibility or interest in how it comes out. And I think we have a tremendous interest in how it comes out. And there are 424,000 Soviet troops in East Germany right now. If it comes out in such a way that there is domination by East Germany of the new unified Germany, it would pose an absolute...
Can you really conceive of that, given what's happened?
Conceive of that.
Now, everybody talks about what they can't conceive of, and nobody could conceive of a few things that happened in China, and nobody could conceive of the fact that Gorbachev...
You can conceive of 17 million East Germans dominating 63 million West Germans?
No, I can conceive of 17,000 Germans augmented by 400,000 or 500,000 Soviet troops with the United States out and NATO out, because everybody says it's no longer necessary. That would be a series that you have to worry about.
Is there universal agreement on this point around the table?
Well, you see 1.5 million East Germans fleeing to West Germany in order to establish communist control in West Germany.
Would Germany unify? would Germany unify on a basis that ensured that Western ideals and the ideals that are followed now by the Federal Republic, the West German Republic, would prevail? And that is a very vital point. And it is not, I think, despite all of the easy sophistries now, it's not guaranteed.
It's not clear to me that the Soviet Union even knows what it wants with respect to Germany. I mean, publicly they are suggesting that obviously the Federal Republic of Germany would have to be out of NATO for the Soviet Union to tolerate closer
involvement.
I was saying no unification.
No, but let me stick with the East German, the German question, and what Mr. Weinberg. Do you share his scenario that there's a danger of it swinging the other way?
It's inconceivable to me that the reunification would take place in a way that would ensure East German control of the unified state and maintenance of Soviet troops there. It's absolutely inconceivable. The fear is not that. The fear is that the reunification takes place in a way that dislodges the unified state from the political frameworks which have stabilized relations among nations in Europe, both East and West. That's the fear. And that's what Gorbachev is pointing to. And don't fail to misread. I haven't talked to Kohl since he put his plan forward, his 10-point plan to unify. Don't fail to misread it, however. And he should be pressed. He comes to the same conclusion, I think, that Gorbachev does, and that I would. There should be no reunification until a new political framework is available. He uses these exact words. The reunified state after Confederation must, quote, fit into the architectural pattern of Europe, unquote. Now, if that doesn't point to some new political framework, I don't know what does. That's what's required.
And
None
that's
of us
where
can
the
see
United States is going to have to be very involved.
Indeed.
Big, and
But what is that new architecture? You
I
all,
don't know.
I mean, nobody has yet begun to
That's right.
articulate what they are. I mean, you all, that's why we have you here. What is, Mr. Rumsfeld, you raised the question. What is that new architect? We want freedom, we want security, we want, in general terms, but what kind of architecture? Are we going to have an architecture of Europe with two alliances 5 years from now? Are we going to have it with three floating states? Are we going to have a single overarching security system? I mean, what kind of thing do you think is useful?
Yeah. I don't know.
An honest man.
Yeah, but I'll be happy to comment.
That's our job.
Yeah, I would speculate that what we will see is, over time, reunification of some kind of Germany. I would suspect that what we will strive for as a country which has been, as Jim Schlesinger pointed out, less uncomfortable with a reunified Germany than some of the Western European countries. We've also been reasonably comfortable with a more integrated Western Europe, and I would guess what you might see is an acceleration in Western Europe towards a greater degree of cohesion. And I would also speculate that you'll see a shift in responsibilities and roles within what is currently NATO, and I hope we will continue to have a reformed NATO, but you'll see a shift in responsibility and roles among the various nations there that will fit the new picture.
Can we begin to sort of turn the compass just a bit? How do we, if we're going to get into a element of understanding with the Soviet Union about expansion of interests and projection of power elsewhere in the world, how do we deal with third world conflicts that in previous circumstances would have drawn us into that kind of conflict?
We have to make it absolutely clear that the Soviet Union, if it continues these kinds of activities, is going to bear full responsibility, not only in political terms, but in economic terms. If the Soviet Union is looking for that respite that Jim Schlesinger mentioned, surely cutting down on the burdens of empire would be one way to do it. Subsidies to Cuba and Nicaragua, they've increased Soviet aid to Cambodia in the past year enormously. So I think we have to say to the Soviets, put up or shut up. You've told us that you want peace around the world. Our only dialogue is not on arms reduction. We have to negotiate with the Soviets on a multifaceted basis: human rights, regional issues, bilateral issues, and arms reductions, and make it clear that they're going to pay a penalty for activities around the world.
Does that mean we should hold up on proceeding with strategic arms reduction, conventional arms reduction in Europe if they won't lay off in Nicaragua?
I'm not arguing for linkage. I'm arguing for a multifaceted agenda. When we go to Moscow or when they come to the United States, they've got a tendency to say, let's just focus on our arms reductions. And we have to say, no, there are some other issues. I think we have to make sure that those issues are always on the agenda and that they're always in the public limelight, so that people don't assume that our interests with the Soviet Union begin and end with arms reduction.
Is there anyone here who thinks we ought to hold up on East-West arms reduction because of the problems in the Third World?
Well, I think we ought to not necessarily hold up on negotiations, but I think we ought to bear in mind the difficulty of verification of conventional arms reduction, and I think we ought to make sure that what kind of Soviet Union we are talking with, whether it's one led by Gorbachev, assuming that he is sincere and honest, or whether it's led by someone who ousted him because he was going too far and allowing too much freedom. Don't forget that that leadership in the Soviet Union can change very rapidly, and that those reductions can be reversed overnight, and we cannot reverse them overnight. It takes us years to do so, and that is a period that I would not want to see us have to go through.
I think Cap's admonition is right on the mark. I don't think that we will fail to verify, but our ability to respond quickly to a change in Soviet policy is indeed limited, as Cap has indicated.
Do you think given their economic difficulties, that they can actually
no,
move
we are
quickly?
looking 7, 8, 10 years down. Right now, the Soviet Union is a basket case. At this juncture, there's no question that the Soviet Union is ideologically bankrupt. But the Soviet Union, or Russia, Imperial Russia before it, has recovered. Imperial Russia, aside from communism, has its own strategic objectives. One of the things that concern me following up the tanker war is the growing dependency on the Persian Gulf. We in the Western world, we here in America are becoming dependent on Persian Gulf oil. If we reduce our defense budgets and the Soviet Union reduces its defense budget, then you can look out at conditions 10 years out in which the Soviet Union, close at hand to the Persian Gulf, could move into that region. So I don't think that anyone should disregard Cap's admonition for the long run. Not immediately, however. The Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, desperately needs relief, and the Soviets understand that.
Let me shift the viewpoint to another basic question that you all have clearly been itching to get at. Let's get into the whole discussion of arms negotiations, force levels, defense spending, which has been coming up repeatedly. There was a recent study by Brookings Institution in Washington asserting that if the present political and diplomatic trends continue, the United States can cut its military budget, now roughly $300 billion a year, down to $150 billion by the year 2000. Do you agree with that?
No.
Mr. McNamara?
Indeed, I do. The study was made by Bill Kaufman. He was...
Let me come back and get your longer answer. Let me just go. We got a no and yes. Mr. Rumsfeld?
Utter nonsense.
Mr. Schlesinger?
I knew I'd be by myself on this.
Maybe not. Let's see how it goes.
How can they even know?
Wait. Let me just get everybody. I want to poll everybody and then let you guys go. Whoa. Wait a minute. Hold it.
When you don't know what you're doing, you suck your thumb and hold it up in the air.
I'll be right back to you. Mr. Schlesinger.
Can we? Sure. Will we? Probably. Should we? No.
We certainly should not. We should remember that Mr. Kaufman, who Mr. McNamara is about to refer to, is one of the architects of the splendid weakness that we found in 1980.
Mr. Laird.
No.
All right. Let me get Mr. Schlesinger to adumbrate his.
That should settle it.
No. You had a wonderful separation here. Let's go through this again. The should we, can we, and will we?
Well, I think that one understands that we now have a current fashion in which going to the defense budget is the way of solving our deficit problems, savings and loan problems, the problems of restraint in the domestic area. We are going to cut, and there is a tidal wave, a political tidal wave for cutting that we should resist. The defense expenditures of the U.S. should be based upon our assessment of the threat and our strategic interests 10 years out. I don't think, given the position the United States should occupy in the world, that we should be thinking seriously about a cut of 50%. But I think it is very likely that the political forces will lead us in that direction.
Mr. Carlucci.
Well, that's the end of U.S. world leadership. Not that our world leadership is based solely on military power, but we have to bear in mind that we're an island nation. We're totally dependent on the rest of the world for strategic resources. So we're going to have to project our power, whether it's, and Jim's absolutely right, our dependence on the Persian Gulf is growing, and all you have to do is look at the proximity of the Gulf to the Soviet Union. The Soviet defense minister at one point said to me, "Why don't you pull your ships out of the Persian Gulf and I'll pull mine out of the Persian Gulf?" I said, "How much oil do you import from the Persian Gulf?" But I think that illustrates the point, that they can make mischief for us very easily, and unfortunately it costs money to protect our strategic interests. This kind of reduction is based on no realistic assessment of the threat. We've been discussing the evolving threat. Everybody's prepared to concede that the threat is changing, but I didn't hear anybody say that the threat has gone away. And cutting our budget down to $150 billion is the equivalent of saying the threat has disappeared and we're no longer going to be a great power.
I'll be right to you. Mr. Laird.
I agree with Frank. I think it's ridiculous to talk about a $150 billion defense budget out 10 years from now. That wouldn't even allow us to maintain any semblance of a military force or an industrial base for military needs. It's just not in the cards if we are going to remain power in the world and to protect freedom and the economic freedom as well as the political freedom that we value so much.
Mr. McNamara.
I can't believe what I'm hearing. We've reduced the danger of the attack through the gap, which all of us have been concerned about, and which our forces in Europe were directed to stopping. Frank says that danger is gone. All right, he didn't say it's gone, it's greatly reduced. I strongly agree with him. Somebody said the Warsaw Pact is dead, but we can't look for anything more than the words were small reductions in the defense budget. It doesn't add up. Now, Kaufman has looked ahead 10 years. He said, number one, I assume Gorbachev goes down the path he said. He's going to reduce forces. You're going to reduce the confrontation between East and Western Europe. I think what we've heard this morning is that's possible. He's moving in that way. If you say the Warsaw Pact is dead, the confrontation is severely reduced. He can't threaten Western Europe. We're not going to dissolve NATO, but we don't have to maintain NATO at present forces. If Gorbachev goes down, as he's proposing, the next step to the conventional force negotiations now underway, and we should be looking ahead. General Galvin is looking ahead, he's reported as saying so, is to think about Andy Goodpaster's, the retired SACEUR. He talks about reducing Warsaw Pact and NATO forces, balancing them at a level not 10 to 15% below NATO's level, which is the current objective of conventional force negotiation, but 50% below. Why not look at it?
All right, what's the cost of that? What's the cost of that 10 years from now?
All right.
You can't even put that in a $150 billion budget.
I'll tell you the reduction. You reduce NATO and Warsaw Pact to 50% of the present level. You have a start one to a nominal 50% of current strategic forces. You have a start two that cuts it again in half. We haven't even talked about, and I hope we will, naval forces. Why shouldn't we be discussing reductions with naval forces, with the Soviets? They're embarked on building one of the first, I think it probably is the first, full-deck carrier. Why the hell should they go in that direction?
I haven't given Mr. Rumsfeld...
Just one
let me come back to you.
Okay.
Let me come back to you.
Hear the Secretary McNamara out.
I'm going to get back to him on...
I'd like to hear this budget detail.
You want to hear the number? Do you have a number? Can you give the congressman a number?
My number is 3% of GNP by roughly 1998.
Okay.
Equal to what the average NATO nation is spending today. Excess.
Mr. Rumsfeld, the basic question, your answer. Can we go halfway down? Does it make sense so far?
Yeah. I think it's an unfortunate question.
It's not going to go away. I don't mean just here, but it's not going to go away.
But I mean, the fact of the matter is that it requires answers to so many assumptions about what the world's going to evolve. And yet, by asking it the way it's asked and allowing people's biases in favor of cutting or in favor of not cutting to just come out, all you get for answers is a bunch of biases. And in fact, the answer is the United States ought not to reduce anything except as they have a concept and demonstrated alterations in the threat that exists in the world.
And that is how we ought to base our decisions, not on some theory of what the probabilities are for the future. Freedom's too precious for that.
Fine.
I don't think we should forget that we can influence what that future will be. We can help guide that future. We can help guide it the way we want it to be, if we keep ourselves sufficiently strong, economically, militarily, involved as a superpower should be, in these events. Bringing your troops home, saying the Cold War is over, on the basis of some kind of assumption that everything that the Soviets are now saying, or one man in the Soviets is saying, is true and going to be permanent. And if you do that, you're going to run into all kinds of problems.
How do you translate cutting whatever figure from the defense budget into fighting the drug war, to bailing out savings and loans in a way that is economically viable, that there's a return from?
I think the Congress will support a reasonable defense budget if it is presented clearly as to the needs of this country, and if we don't get into a lot of inter-service military bickering over what is needed so that each service can run its own war. I think that the time has come when you have to really have strong, tight leadership over the budget in the Department of Defense and articulate that budget very clearly to the Congress, and I think you'll get good support. They are going to make some personnel cuts. The Congress looks over at the Department of Defense and they say that they have the same number of four-star generals and admirals that they had back at the height of the Vietnam War. They say that they haven't made the personnel reductions and adequately put them and placed them where they should be. I think the Congress is apt to be very critical of the defense budget as it goes, as it starts this next year. But I think that that can be corrected, and I think the Congress will support an adequate budget.
Secretary Schlesinger, pick up on that point. Where can the budget cuts be taken in a way that are politically palatable and acceptable in security terms?
Politically palatable, of course, we can cut manpower to the bone. The political system will just love that, but that's irresponsible. Let me say, in partial support of Bob McNamara,
Thank God.
Will you hear him?
wait till you hear me.
I'll take even partial support.
If you're prepared to provide 3% of the GMP, 10 years from now, that is $200 billion, and that means a one-third cut in defense expenditures rather than
If you'll support that, I'll support it.
You've come up to $200 billion?
If you'll sign on, yes.
Well,
I need a little help.
No, we've got you up here. I'm not going to sign on.
Don't sell out for $50 billion that cheaply.
The thing that we have got to understand is that in the buildup of the 1980s, we did not increase manpower significantly. We did not increase force structure significantly. When we cut in 1945, we moved from 12 million men to 1.5 million men under arms. In the period after the Vietnam War, we started from a base of 3.7 million, and we cut to 2.1 million. That's where we are today. We are starting from lower manpower levels than ever before. And while we undoubtedly will cut manpower to some extent, if we are to continue to have a major capability in the world, we cannot cut too deeply into the manpower account. As Mel has already indicated, if we are to remain on the cutting edge of military technology, and we ought to be aware that others are going to be competing in this area, we can take prudent cuts in R&D, but they are going to be modest cuts. On procurement, if we maintain force structure, we have to have forces coming in, equipments coming into the system, and we're not going to do that slashing away at the budget. So I think that one recognizes that our deployments in Europe will be reduced, but the amount of savings that we're going to get out of this do not match up with the $150 billion, 50% reductions.
While I agree with Jim that you should not slash manpower too much, I am of the view that the only sensible way to make budget cuts is to bring down force structure, which not only brings down manpower, but brings down the equipment with it. I'd much rather have a smaller, more mobile and flexible military establishment than a large one that has been hollowed out, as we tended to do in the 1970s. My understanding of the Brookings study, and I haven't read the study that you referred to, is that it looks at it the other way around. It talks about cutting R&D, technology, and procurement and keeping manpower up. I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
If you're going to make a modest percentage cut in the defense budget, there's probably nothing wrong with going to the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force and saying, give me all your sevens and let me look at them, and then they look at them.
Sevens being the lowest grade on the list.
Whatever they're willing to toss in. You know, the first thing the Air Force tosses in is Air Force One, knowing you won't cut it. But for the administration to ask the services to come up with cuts totaling $100 billion, the worst thing in the world, $180 billion, the worst thing in the world you could do. You're going to end up with the Army's view of the world, the Navy's view of the world, the Air Force's view of the world. Mill's absolutely correct. You've simply got to engage the issue. The Congress will do what's right, reasonably right, over time.
Well,
but they won't do it if somebody doesn't, if the department and the executive branch doesn't say, here's our concept, here's our doctrine, here's our redefined threat, and here are the resources we need to deal with it.
If Gorbachev is prepared to go down and match us at whatever level we go down to, what is a good level to sustain the kind of American presence in Europe that you gentlemen all say we need to have 5 years down the pike or 10 years down the pike if he is prepared to go down? What do we need over the long run?
Common ceilings? I mean, this is very important, not proportional reductions.
No, I'm talking about common ceilings.
You could come down to something like 150,000 if you get both sides coming down to common ceilings, if you eliminate or bring down that offensive weaponry, tanks, self-propelled artillery, to common ceilings, you could have a stable situation and
you
about
can do
half
that,
the troops.
You can do that in Asia too. I mean, you can work out, and I think we haven't talked about that, but when I was over in the Defense Department, we made our first reduction in Korea. We came down about 20,000. We had a program to go down to a level of about 18,000. That program has never been really implemented, but it could be, and that will be implemented probably within the next 5 years.
Mr. Schlesinger, do you agree with Mr. Carlucci?
Yes,
We could cut our forces in half in
I
Europe?
think we can cut our forces in half, and perhaps even a slightly more than half. But we must maintain a presence over there of substantial combat forces, and we must recognize that we're going to have a substantial logistical capability for reinforcement.
Isn't there also a message for our allies in all this, in that, as I hear you all, the United States cannot afford to get out of Europe or reduce its forces in Europe to the point of political impotence so that the Europeans get themselves in trouble as they have twice already in this century? Isn't that an element?
There is that message. There's another political message, which is that we are not going to stand by while our European allies cut their forces and we pay more to defend them. That is not politically salable to the American people.
The question here has been raised by several of you several times about whether or not you can really count on the Soviets. How convinced are you that Gorbachev has, Mr. Carlucci, how convinced are you that Gorbachev has actually begun restructuring Soviet forces and begun changing tank production as they've promised and their posture, as opposed to words? I mean, what do you see so far, and how convinced are you?
Within the past couple of months, we have begun to notice some changes. Indeed, tank production is being cut. Gorbachev is seeking to reduce 7% a year. He announced a 14.2% cut for 90 and 91, and it looks like that cut is underway. Bear in mind a couple of things, though. That cut is from a very large base. They were producing some 3,000 tanks a year. We produce 600. So they've got a long way to come down. They also have a very heavy conventional inventory. The second thing to bear in mind, and this is very perplexing, is that while there have been some modifications to their strategic forces, possibly building fewer Typhoons, and we had estimated those seem to be
submarines.
They seem to be compensated by Delta IVs, increased production of Delta IVs. Their strategic modernization program continues. And those are the very fast-moving missiles that can reach the United States in half an hour, or if they're from submarines, even less. And that I find particularly troubling. So we see some progress, but it's certainly not enough to grab a hold of and say, boy, we can slash our defense budget on the basis of what we've seen so far.
Mr. McNamara, do you agree with that assessment?
I agree that there's evidence they are cutting. The CIA has reported, they made public statements of it. I also agree with Frank that not all the evidence is in.
Mr. Schlesinger, your assessment of whether or not something is actually happening there that we can count on having happened, not just being words.
Of course something's happening there. In the first place, they are pulling tanks out of the NATO area. They are reducing manpower in the NATO area. They are reducing their offensive punch marginally, but they are reducing it. In terms of military equipment, last year they dropped about 3%. For next year it's projected to drop about 7%. It's reflected in part in these major equipment items that Frank referred to. The whole purpose of Gorbachev is to get some respite so that he can begin to improve his economy. Unless he gets relief on the defense side, he's going to frustrate his own purpose. He's not that foolish.
What you're seeing is a situation in which there may be an occasional dip for a short time, but the secular trend is indeed up. And as far as their being able to reconvert quickly or not, the problem that we really have had all this time is that they spend about 23 to 25% that we know about of their gross national product on military matters. And they do have easily convertible factories. It is very easy for them, and indeed it'll be one of the things that a successor to Gorbachev will want to think out very closely as to whether or not cutting back on the military doesn't produce such economic dislocations, in addition to what they already have, which are severe, that he may not be able to continue it. And so you've got all of these things pointing toward a lack of permanence in what we're seeing now that we like. And we've only been seeing it for a very few months. And we must never forget that that can shift.
Well, you understand that the worst thing about Gorbachev, that rascal, is that he's taking away our threat. And once that happens...
Are you yearning for the Cold War?
Now, here, Cap is an old-line preacher on this subject, and an old-line preacher has difficulty when the demon begins to go away.
Talking about the new world that we have been discussing here, not just about troop cuts and arms reduction and arms negotiations and figuring out strategies and threats. Mr. McNamara, in a recent book of yours, you've talked about, and today you talked about the notion of some kind of code of conduct moving to the point where diplomacy replaces military means of achieving foreign policy goals. Tell us your basic conception there, and whether or not you think it is actually realistic at this stage of our relationship with the Soviets.
Well, I don't think it's realistic to think that in the next 6 months, for example, we could negotiate or discuss a code of conduct and come to agreement on it with the Soviet Union. But I do believe that it's time to talk about it. We have said the threat has been reduced. That's a common statement here. Dramatically was a term that somebody used. I think it has been substantially reduced. But whether it is significantly reduced in relation to defense depends on what we think the Soviet behavior will be, and that gets to the code of conduct. Now, what do I mean by a code of conduct? I mean that they and we would agree to do what Gorbachev has said he wants us to do. A, no unilateral intervention in regional conflicts. That's very important. Do we trust him on it? Only if we see his forces that are capable of intervening or supporting regional conflicts reduced. We can discuss that and verification of it. And even then, only if there is some substitute. There are going to be conflicts. We can discuss with Gorbachev how we're going to deal with regional conflicts. We should do so. We can talk about arms flow. We and they are fueling these conflicts. We must discuss how we're going to gradually reduce the flow of arms from the Soviets and from ourselves to all the regions of the world.
But you and others have said there are going to be regional conflicts. Who polices those? The United Nations? Do people around this table think that that will work?
They would all say no. Why would they say that? They would say no, the UN can't police it, and they can't. But why can't the UN police it? Because the US and the Soviet Union for their own reasons, immediately after the formation of the UN, prevented it from developing the conflict resolution and the peacekeeping capabilities that Roosevelt and Churchill intended it should have. We and the Soviets should begin to talk about how we can strengthen it. We can't strengthen it when we owe them today $550 or $600 million on our past assessments.
I agree with Bob that we ought to talk about a code of conduct, but we ought to be very wary. We have not only talked about such a code of conduct, we signed an agreement with the Soviet Union in 1973, shortly before the Soviet Union spurred the Middle Eastern War in 1973. A code of conduct is significant, but a code of conduct can be very easily broken.
And I would agree with that, but let's start talking.
Do you think something like this could develop in a realistic way?
I would
Mr.
hope
Laird?
that it could sometime. I would hope that it could, but I am not at all convinced that it will.
Gentlemen, we thank you all, and I know that on your behalf, I will be justified in offering our general thanks to Vanderbilt University here in Nashville, to all the people of Tennessee, and to our audience here this morning in the Tennessee Performing Arts Center. Thank you.
And to our three moderators.
This program was produced by the Southern Center for International Studies, which is solely responsible for its content. A production of the Southern Center for International Studies. For a transcript, please send $5 to Secretaries of Defense, P.O. Box 9783, Atlanta, Georgia 30319, or call 404-261-5763 during business hours.
This is PBS.